In a previous video, we learned about the Telerik UI for ASP.NET Core Data Grid Tag Helper. In this video, we'll learn how to tie together all of our tag helpers to create a spa-like application. Now on our form, we have date pickers and this nice tree view tag helper. And what we'd like to do is wire together these components so they act as a filter for our data grid and update the UI up at the top of the application. The first thing that I'd like to do is select by default the first member of this tree view, so we always have a member selected when our application loads. Let's jump into our application, and in our menu panel partial tag helper, we have our Kendo UI tree view. Now when the application loads, the tree view will look for data. So let's bind to the onDataBound event for this tag helper. So just hit space here and get IntelliSense going, and we'll say on data, whoops, not on change, we'll do on data bound. And when we bind data, I need to set up an event handler in JavaScript. And that event handler can be named anything, but for this example, we'll call it onListDataBound. So back in our index, we just need to scroll down to where we have our scripts section, and we'll open up this script tag here, and we'll insert a piece of JavaScript. So I'll create a function with the same name that I specified in my tag helper, and we'll call this onListDataBound. And when it fires, we'll say this select, and we'll specify using jQuery to select the class of kItem and the first element of that class. So in our tree view, every item has this class of kItem. So we're just grabbing the first one and setting that to our selected item. So if we save this and go back to our application, we should have, and there it is, the first item selected. And now that we've selected the item, we can use the data from the tree view to populate this avatar and full name value. We'll do that using a Kendo UI template. Let's go back to our code, and we'll need to modify our JavaScript slightly to take advantage of a Kendo UI template. Let's start at the top of our script tag here and set up a placeholder for the selected value from that tree view. We'll cache it here because we're going to be using it quite a bit in the rest of the application. When we bind our list view here, let's set the employee state. So we'll say employee state equals this, and we'll get the data source from the tree view. Then we'll say get by unique ID. So we're going to get the record by the unique identifier, and we'll set that by saying this select, which will grab the selected item, and we'll say dataset unique ID. This will get the unique identifier from the selected item and select it from the data source and store it in the employee state. Now we need a template to apply this data to. So let's go up in our application, and we'll grab this piece of code that we're currently using as a placeholder. And we'll cut that out because we're not going to need it anymore. It's going to be replaced by the template and injected on this ID. So where we have div ID employee about, we're going to set this inner HTML with the Kendo UI template. So we'll move that code to the bottom of the page, and then we just need to apply the Kendo UI template here. We need to tell Kendo UI that this is a valid template, so we'll need to wrap that HTML in a special script tag. So let's wrap this code in a script with this type set to text Kendo template, and we'll set the ID to employee avatar template. This will allow us to find the template in our code. We'll close off that script tag, And then we need to create a function to apply that template. So back in our JavaScript, we'll create a function called updateEmployeeAvatar. And then we'll find the template in our page. We'll say Kendo template. We'll find it, get the inner HTML, and then that will be our template. And then we just need to apply the template. So we're going to replace the employee about inner HTML with the rendered template using the employee state. So when we pass in the object employee state, it will apply those values to the template. Now we haven't told the template where to place any of those values yet. So let's go back up to the HTML and replace this image placeholder with a templated image. So we'll say image, we'll set the source to a folder that is on our disk. And using the templating language, we'll say #: to represent a property of employee ID. So we'll grab the value from employee ID and we'll concatenate that to the file extension. And we'll do the same thing for the employee name. We'll just use that # syntax. And we'll say full name, which represents the property on the object we're binding to our template. So now we just need to take employee update avatar and tell our code to apply that avatar template after the onList databound event occurs. So we should be able to go back to our application now and refresh. Andrew Fuller is selected. However, when I select other team members, notice the avatar doesn't update. This is because Andrew is selected on databound, but now we're firing then an onSelect event. So let's go bind to the onSelect event and update our avatar. What I'll do next is add a reference to the UI elements on the page. So I'll create a nice placeholder called UI. We'll set up a variable here, and we'll use a function that initializes on page load to capture that reference. So we'll say UI equals tree. We'll find the employee list and tell that employee list it's a Kendo UI component. So we'll say data Kendo UI tree view. Next, we need to set up a function that we can call onSelect. I'll call this function setEmployeeState, and we'll pass in from the onSelect function the argument of E, which is the currently selected item. We'll say employee state equals UI tree data source get by unique identifier, and then we'll get the currently selected items node and use the datasets unique identifier. That'll get the employee state object from the tree view. And then we'll tell the UI to update. So we need to set up this function that instructs our UI to update. And in that function, we'll call update employee avatar. So whenever any criteria on our application changes, we will call that update avatar. We're going to have multiple controls on the page that will refer to this onCriteriaChanged handler. So whenever we make changes to our tree view or any of our date pickers, we're going to call back on this to update our UI. Next, we need to go to our tree view and make sure that we fire the set event handler. So we'll say on select, we can say set, and our IntelliSense will help us find our set employee state function that we created. So a set employee state is fired whenever we select an item. That will capture the employee state and update the employee avatar. Now, to make sure that we don't inadvertently write over our employee state, we'll just put a guard in the onDataBound event. And we'll say, if that employee state is not currently set, then we'll run this piece of code. This will keep us from overwriting that employee state by accident if new items are loaded to the tree view. Let's go back to our application and refresh the app. We have Andrew, and now if we expand these items and select Nancy, Margaret, the avatar updates along with the selected team members. Next, let's wire up all of these tag helpers to update the data grid and synchronize all of the controls together. So let's jump back into our code and complete this task. The first thing we need to do is add some more references to our UI references here. We'll make a reference to our stats from date picker, stats to date picker, and our employee sales data grid. Next, when the onCriteria changed event happens, we need to tell our data grid to update its data source. So we'll say UI grid data source, and we'll call the read function on the data grid. This will get us fresh data back from the server, and we want to pass in some criteria values to our data grid. So we want a custom search based on the employee that is selected and the stats from and to boxes that we've created. So we set up this simple object that we return from a function. The function is called getOrderSearchCriteria, and it returns the employee name, salesperson, the dates from, and dates to that we'd like to search by. This object gets bound on our controller, which allows us to use NAD Framework to search for these values and return a filtered data set back to the data grid. We'll need to instruct the data grid on where to find this. So let's go back into our invoice grid. Let's take the tag helper, and on the read action, we'll tell it where to find the extra data to send back to the server. So we'll use this data attribute, and we just need to take the getOrderSearchCriteria function and call that here. So this will send back our data for data binding on the controller and NAD Framework for the link query that executes. Since we're already calling the read method directly, we can set the auto bind to false on the data grid. This means the data grid won't try to bind data automatically when the data grid loads. We're calling read directly, so we don't need to do that any longer. Next, we need to call onCriteria changed from a few places. First, let's tell our onListDataBound to call this instead of updateEmployeeAvatar. Since updateEmployeeAvatar takes place on criteria change anyway, we can use the onListDataBound event to call onCriteria change. We also need to call it from our UI elements that provide our inputs. So in the Kendo UI date picker for the stats to and from, I've added the onChange event and handled it with the onCriteria changed method. I've done that for both date pickers, and also for the Kendo UI tree view, this is being set when we call setEmployeeState. So all three of these components fire the onCriteria changed event, either directly or indirectly. So we can save this and go back to our application and refresh. And now we should have custom filtering with our data grid. So we start with Andrew Fuller, and we can click on Nancy. Notice the data grid updates with new data. And we could also set a different date range, and we can filter the dates and times for this data grid. So we could, for example, set this to 1997 or the current date. So we don't have any data for the current date, so nothing is displayed. We could say 1997, and now we have records from 1997 to 1998. So we've completely bound this entire form to our data grid. If we look at our controller, we can see where that data is coming back. We have our request, and then we have our custom data as salesperson and stats to and from, and these are provided by that JavaScript function called getOrderSearchCriteria. So that completes our application so far. In the next video, we'll look at how to add charts, and we'll tie into that onCriteria changed event to make sure that our filters applied values to the charts as well.